Hello! I've got a couple of new gadgets that I've made for my workshop. I put some retractable casters on my table saw. It works pretty slick. So all this is a plywood panel. I just used a piece that I had on hand. And I attached some casters onto it. These are the type that can swivel around. I used 1¼ casters because they were about the biggest size that I could put on here and make it work. And they work pretty good, although there are a couple of rough spots on my floor where it kind of gets hung up a little bit. The board is attached to some hinges, and that's screwed onto this piece of 2x3. Then the 2x3 is screwed onto the table saw legs. The front end is this board that's hinged and pops up like so. Now to make that pop up, I used one of these ball ties. They're just a little bungee with a plastic ball on it. You can get them where they have camping supplies or tarp accessories. It just goes through a hole in this, and the other end's hooked on a screw. That's what makes this pop up like so. Now I screwed up a bit when I put the hinge on this piece. I wound up with this gap at the bottom here. So all I did to make this piece stand up straight is I just put in a couple of flathead wood screws and left the head sticking up a little bit. That way this thing stands up the way it's supposed to. To make this, I started off by cutting my plywood panel that would have the casters attached to it. I used the widest piece I had that would fit between the saw legs. It was something like this, about 1 inch wider in this, and longer of course. Now to figure out the length, I determined how high this was going to sit with the wheels on it. And then I measured that up on the leg, and then measured from front to back. And then that's how long I cut the board. Because it was going to attach onto a 2x3 like this. And so this extra 1.5 would make it stick out that far in the front. So once I had the wheels attached to the panel, I moved my saw over to the flattest part of the floor I could find, and I put 3/4 inch thick blocks under each leg. Then I wheeled the panel underneath. Next thing I did was I set on a piece of 2x3, just a little short piece like this, and that allowed me to put my ruler on top, like this, and measure across between the inside of these legs to determine how long this piece had to be. And you know how the legs are angled. Well, I didn't bother beveling the ends of this. I just measured along the top, and that's how long I cut them. And once I had a piece that fit in there good, then I took that and I attached it to the hinges and attached the hinges to the board with the wheels on it. So once I had that all done, then I slid it underneath the saw again. I put masking tape on the legs of the saw because it was easier to mark on the tape. Although I forgot to take the tape off when I put the screws in. But anyways, I slid the board in place, and then I was able to mark onto the saw legs where the screw holes should be. I moved the assembly out of the way and drilled the holes in the leg of the saw. I drilled those oversized so that the screw would pass right through it. So once I had the 4 holes drilled, I again slid the assembly back in place and used a pencil to mark where the screws were going to be onto this piece. Then I was able to drill some holes and then attach the screws. And because the screws weren't having a thread through this, they were just going right through, I didn't have to worry about clamping this in place. I just lined up the holes and put the screws in. So that took care of this part of it. The front of the wheel panel needs something to hold it in place. The first idea I had was to take a little piece of plywood and put a bolt through it, and then I drilled a hole here. And the idea was this piece bolted on like so, and you pushed on it with your toe and then swung it over, and it hooked underneath this block that I had screwed onto the front leg. That worked okay, but it wasn't great. So then I got the idea for this pop-up board that works a whole lot better. To figure out the length of this, all I did was measure on the back side, you know, where that 2x3 is like this, I measured from the bottom of that up to the bottom of this. And then I cut a board that was a little bit longer. And then I brought it around the front and figured out, test fitted it in there, and then cut it so it was an exact fit. So here's more of a close-up of that board in action. All you do is step down on the panel and then lift up on the front of the saw, and the board pops in place, and you move the saw around. And once you get it where you want the saw to be, again you just lift up slightly, and then you step on that kind of like a pedal. And with mine, because I got this cardboard tray in here, sometimes I gotta pull up on it a little bit. And now the wheels are out of the way and the saw is nice and solid. I got a really simple fence that I made for my bandsaw. It's just a straight piece of wood with a little block at 90 degrees. You just line it up like this, and then you clamp it down. I use this kind of clamp because it's got to be able to get up underneath the table. So this works really good. Now, I wasn't sure how accurate I was going to get this. So I added in a couple of flathead wood screws that are countersunk so that they're below the surface. So that way, when I put this up, if it isn't quite 90 degrees, it's just a simple matter of taking one of the screws and turning it out a bit, and that'll act like a shim, and that way you can true the fence. For my miter saw, I made this stop block. It's a long piece of 2x2 that has another smaller block of 2x2 attached to it. I've got the screws so they're in the top half of this piece, and that's what attaches it to the longer piece. And through the bottom half, I've got this 1/4 inch carriage bolt that runs through. Instead of a wing nut, I've got a round knob that has a T-nut in it because it's a little bit easier to handle than a wing nut. The other important thing is this small nail. So the way it works is it's going to attach onto one of these holes in this support piece on the extension on my miter saw. First I have to set this to the right height. Right about there. I've got a felt pen mark on there so I know where to set it. Now I'll tighten up this knob here. Now even with this tight, this piece will still rock back and forth. So that's what this little nail is for. It just tucks in there. Now that's not going to move. So I just slip in the carriage bolt, tighten on the knob. And now I can move this back and forth like so. So the way I use this is I tighten up the knob on the extension so that this can't move easily, but I still want it to be able to move a little bit right now. Then I take my piece of wood and mark a line on it. You can line it up. And then I can take this and tap it a little bit this way or tap it back the other way until it's lined up perfect. Tighten that knob down, and then I can go ahead and make repetitive cuts. I know I've covered this in one of my other videos, but these deserve a second mention. The most important thing I ever put on this saw is this oversized panel that's mounted in front of the switch. You can see it's just a hinged panel, and I've got this other piece that it's attached to, and that's screwed onto the leg. It's important to note that this just sits in front of the switch. It's not attached to it. Now the reason I put this on is because the switch on my table saw is pretty small. It's the same size as the switch on my drill press. The panel's got this notch cut in it so I can reach the switch. So to turn the saw on, I have to reach down and actually flip the switch up. Then I go ahead and make the cut, and when I'm done doing that, I can hit it anywhere on this panel to shut the saw off. I can hit it with my knee, or I can even hit it with my foot. That way I'm not trying to reach down and find that little tiny switch to stop the saw. Makes using the table saw a whole lot safer. Underneath the saw, I mounted a cardboard tray. And I added on these cardboard wings that stick out each side. And that catches the lion's share of the sawdust. Makes cleanup pretty easy. Just vacuum it out of the tray. My table saw fence was a little flimsy, so I beefed it up on both sides with some 3/4 inch MDF. The way I attached this is I got some square bend U-bolts, and I cut off one side of it, something like that. Then that end just goes into one of these holes here and goes through and bolts onto the other piece. It makes the fence a lot stronger and a lot more accurate. With my fence secured on the extension, and the extension out as far as it'll go, I only got about a 22-inch capacity. So I made this auxiliary fence. So this fence is made to fit directly onto the end of the extension panel. I drilled a couple of bolt holes. You'll note how the end of these rods stick out like this. So I also had to bore out on the fence some recesses to accommodate those. So this fence then just bolts right onto the end of the table. And you know what, I've made it so I can fit it on the other side as well. And so now with this fully extended, I've got over 25.5 inches. I can just slide the extension back and forth until I get it where I want it. Though of course it is very important to measure front and back, and then tighten down these knobs to keep the extension from moving before you make your cut. The back of my saw has this out feed support you pull out like so. It's always stiff trying to get it out, but it does work pretty good. So I made this simple little extension for it. It's just a piece of plywood with a couple of blocks that I stuck these 3/8 carriage bolts in. I've just got a piece of tape on there to keep the bolts from coming out. And it just slides on like that. So a lot of times I won't even pull this out, I'll just slip this piece on. But it's also handy if I'm doing cutting a long piece, that I can slide the extension out to its full length and put this on for a little bit of extra support. This thing just hangs nicely on the back of the saw. There's a little recess here where the bolt goes, so I put a nail in this piece, and it just hooks into the hole and keeps it from falling off. The wheels make it pretty easy to move this saw around, even on the rough floor. Although I do see one particularly bad spot in the floor that happens to be right in front of where the saw goes. So I think I might have to patch that. Thanks for watching.